This episode of the Multiamory podcast is brought to you by Quip, modern oral care delivered. For a free toothbrush head refill, go to tryquip.com/multiamory.
Sin, rather than being like a permanent thing that requires a permanent cure, is a thing that like happens again and again. And so both sin and cleansing are like a cycle that happen over and over and over again. Like they're both temporary.
If you're happy with the same old ways of dating,
If you enjoy sucking at communication,
and you have no desire to improve your romantic life, then our podcast might not be for you.
but if you want some out-of-the-box ideas to deepen your current relationships,
broaden your sexual horizons,
develop a better understanding of yourself,
or learn more about non-monogamy,
Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jace,
I'm Emily.
and I'm Dedeker.
and this is the Multiamory podcast.
Songs I know I did, forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're talking about polyamory, sexuality, and Christianity. We have two very special guests, Reverend Austin Adkinson, a Methodist pastor in Seattle, and J.D. Mechelke, who is a youth minister and theology grad student in Minnesota. And we're talking with them about their takes on the current state of affairs regarding sex and multi-partner relationships in the Christian church. Super exciting. I've been wanting to do this topic with some actual theologians and pastors as guests for quite a while. So I'm really excited that we found not just one, but two people who were interested in coming on the show to discuss it.
Prepare to have your mind blown. I know mine was.
It's a very educational one for Emily.
Definitely.
All right, well, with that, let's get to the interview.
All right. Well, Austin, JD, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So I guess we'll do this one at a time. Can both of you introduce yourselves and let our listeners know a little bit more about who you are and what it is that you do? I guess I'll just call from the head of the class. Let's start with Austin.
Alphabetical order gets me every time.
Exactly.
I'm Austin Adkinson. I am a United Methodist pastor in Seattle. In the church world, in addition to leading a congregation in North Seattle, I'm part of the leadership of the United Methodist Queer Clergy Caucus, which is working for a more inclusive church. And also outside the church world, I'm on the board of directors at the Paneros Foundation here in Seattle, and specifically, I'm mostly working with our Consent Academy project, which is a new launch in the last year and a half or so, where we're working on bringing consent education to a variety of different groups.
Nice.
Very cool. And how about you, JD?
I'm J.D. Mechelke, and I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm a grad student in theology at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. I'm also a high school youth minister at a Lutheran church, a liberal Lutheran church here in the Twin Cities. And so my current projects are around sexuality education with youth in the church, comprehensive, progressive sexuality education, and also creating a kinky doctrine of sin is my biggest project right now. So.
And is that a book or a paper or a site?
What does that mean?
It's just a long paper. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the Christian symbols into different realms of ethics in the BDSM communities.
Oh, interesting.
Fascinating. I'd love to talk more about that at some point.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll have time for it
What
today,
are
but
Christian symbols?
Say it again?
Did you say the word Christian
Yeah,
symbols?
it's just
What is that?
It's like a theological jargon for like the narrative of the Bible, the things that you hear. It's like like Shakespeare. People know these quotes from Shakespeare, right? People know these quotes from the Bible, right? We have these ideas of what Christianity is within our culture and within, Western literature. And it's those kinds of like themes. Yeah, some of us, thank you. Yeah. And it's those themes that I kind of, it's Christian symbols, pulling those out.
Okay, I see.
If that's helpful at all.
I think Emily was
totally.
imagining like runes and
No,
archaic
I was.
symbols
I was
and
like,
stuff.
are there different symbols?
Yeah, yes.
I don't know, Austin. You looked like you had something to say as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to JD that there's an article I should point him to that just got written by a friend of mine. I think there at Claremont that is right in that area. So it's something that you should be aware of. We can talk about that after.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Let me just say, I just have to interject to say that this is so exciting. It's the first time for us to have multiple guests. If I had my way, we would have like 5 different faith leaders on a panel that we'd be recording right now. That'd be a little bit of chaos for a podcast. But it's just really nice to be able to at least get like some variety of perspective here.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Em, as our sort of designated person who doesn't know anything about any of this, can you start us off?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely, as you can see, and anyone who knows anything about this podcast knows that I'm like the noob when it comes to all things like religion or Christianity or the Bible or anything. But from my like super limited knowledge, it does seem like things like the nuclear family or monogamy or fidelity are all like super important parts of a religious lifestyle. So I don't really understand how something like polyamory, which for all intents and purposes kind of seems like in direct opposition to all those things or parts of all those things, like how would polyamory in any way be okay to a religious person, let alone like pastors?
We stumped him already.
I know, right?
So just
right out the gate.
just straight for the jugular. Yeah, I would say it's absolutely a minority viewpoint within most of Christianity today, and no one person can speak for all of Christianity. There are lots of different flavors and varieties, but even within each denomination, there would be there's very little discussion around polyamory in most churches. Most sexual ethics that are being debated in most denominations right now are just around homosexuality. At least in my denomination, the prohibitions that we're fighting against are self-avowed practicing homosexuals. The people who want to be discriminatory don't even know the range of things that they should be trying to prohibit. So homosexuality is the level of debate that's happening right here. There are a lot of pastors, though, that have a lot more nuanced perceptions or nuanced perspectives, and will work with. There are a lot of pastors out there that will work with people where they are and not see this as a primary emphasis. And there were a lot of layers to the question, and I'm not really sure I'm going to hit all of them. But the nuclear family was kind of where it kind of got started as a lead. And that is certainly a value that a lot of Christianity is held on to. But its origins are not really something that comes from any of the passages directly from Jesus or from other places. In fact, most of the places where family stuff and gender roles within the family come in are much later writings that got attributed to the Apostle Paul after the fact, and were really rooted in the Roman household code. So it was a secular basis for the nuclear family idea being passed along. And as Christianity reached into the beyond Judaism and into the Hellenistic world, that value and the patriarchy stuff kind of crept into some of the writing. But we're actually coming up on a lectionary cycle, and Emily, for you, the lectionary word, and actually even maybe for
yes, for us too, because that just sailed right over.
Lectionary is a,
you got it?
You were saying electionary.
Yeah,
I voted.
Yeah, you
That's
voted
not what
today.
You were saying. This is not what you were saying.
But the lectionary is a scheduled set of readings that churches do on a 3-year cycle to hit most of the Bible in church readings over the course of 3 years. So most mainline churches are going to be preaching on similar scriptures any given Sunday. And
really?
And so this coming Sunday, one of the scriptures is actually about Jesus is teaching in a group, and somebody says, "Hey, Jesus, your mother and your brothers are here. Don't you want to go talk to them?" And he says, "Who is my mother? Who is my brother? All those who," I'm going to butcher the exact quote here because I'm not that kind of Christian, but basically saying, all those who honor my Father in heaven are the translations I would use are brothers and sisters in Christ. But I think the actual Greek is brothers. So Jesus was actually saying, our family is those who we are doing faithful love and working toward the kingdom of God with. So that so Jesus, which is not to say that Jesus was anti-family, although his mother and his brothers probably would have been hurt to hear him say that. It was a much more expansive idea of who we love and care for is a large part of Jesus's message. And so it's absolutely true that most of Christian history has focused on nuclear family, but I would say that's a secular value that got religifified. Is that a word?
It is now.
Rather than the other way around. And so a lot of, and there's a lot of Christianity in general, a lot of assumptions about what it means to be Christian that have come through the historical thing and rather than what Jesus was really focused on. And so when I do things that challenge people's concepts of what the Bible really says or doesn't say, you have to look a lot at the context of what each piece of writing, what was happening around it, and not just take it at face value. So I bring a lot of nuance into it, and that's how I get at it. So there's nothing in the Bible that's going to say polyamory is good, because there was no such phrase for that. But challenges of who we love and who we're supposed to love, and really loving everyone, is at the center of things through all of Jesus's teachings, and that's what I try to focus on. So I'm less of a rigid, here are the rules that Christians are supposed to follow, and more focused on how do we focus on loving the people around us better and seeking justice and caring for making the world more like God intends it to be.
Right.
Lovely.
Great.
JD, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, the thing I would say is, so you mentioned, this religious lifestyle. Is it compatible with polyamory? I think when, at least in Minnesota, maybe, I'm not sure if it's the same on the West Coast, but when I hear ideas or discourse about Christian religious lifestyle, it's always co-opted by the religious right, by conservative Christians. And so even when you start talking about the religious lifestyle, there's a lot of variance, I would say, within the denominations, within the different parts of Christianity about what constitutes a religious lifestyle, or if we give a shit about a religious lifestyle. I'd also say that, like, in the history of Christianity, there was a lot of, particularly in the monasteries, in the monastic tradition, that's where super cool Christians, they would leave their mother and father, they would take up poverty, chastity, obedience, or something like that, and they'd just hang out in a community, they'd pray all day. That's monastic life. And so in that monastic life, there's particularly in medieval times, there's a lot of talk about sexual relationships in monastic life. And it was not, it's not even uncommon at all, even today. So that in monastic life, to have sexual relations with each other. And so in Christianity, or at least the history of Christianity, the best, religious lifestyle was this monastic life. Yet they are the ones that are polyamorous in many ways. And I could say a lot more about that, but I'll stop.
Right. And
No, that's great.
It's great. I can tell that you're working on your PhD right now and on your thesis, because I can tell your brain just has like too much information. It's like, how do I filter this all down?
I know. So forgive me if I'm being too precise, because I'm like,
well, can you give us a citation for that?
Yeah. We'll expect a bibliography at the end of this.
Yeah.
All right. So actually, kind of related to what both of you talked about, I actually wanted to take us kind of back a second, rather than talking about polyamory, but to talk about kind of the more current debate, as Austin was pointing out, about homosexuality. And that I think when people start thinking about, whatever it is, family values or whatever about the Bible, that I feel like where most people's mind goes is to homosexuality. Like, is that okay or is it not? I feel like maybe when I was a kid, that debate would have been more just focused on like, don't cheat. But I feel like now when you bring that up, immediately where people's minds go is homosexuality. And for me, this was something that I got super fascinated with in college. And we had a guest speaker come to our school, and he was a former Catholic priest who was giving this presentation on what the Bible really says about homosexuality. And, you know, talked about things like how Jesus never says anything about it. And in fact, perhaps even helped cure the centurion's, servant boy, who at that time most likely would have also had a sexual relationship with him. Like, kind of point out little things like that, as well as looking at some of the specific wording used in the Old Testament about, you know, what, like that it's an abomination for a man to lie with another man, like those sorts of things kind of went into the nitty gritty about all of that, I guess. And I guess I was just wondering if, I feel like I gave a super quick little summary there, if you could kind of bring us up to speed on like, what is that kind of what the debate is centered around right now within the denominations, at least the ones in the United States that you guys are part of? Like, is that still the debate about like these specific wordings, or has it moved to some other place than that?
I could speak to like the theological shift that's going on, but Austin might be more equipped to deal with like what's actually going on in the church, because my church is super gay. We've been marrying same-sex couples since like the 80s. So I'm not
so,
exactly
like, no problem.
So like, yeah, right. So Austin might be better to talk about like socially what's going on in the church. But
yeah, and well, maybe because every denomination and and then there are a lot of churches that are non-denominational as well. So every situation is going to, whether it's denominational or congregational, is going to have its own area of focus on it. And I would say most of it's happening at the congregational level, and it usually starts with caring for individuals who are part of that congregation. There are people who, a child grows up and comes out whose family has been a long part of the church, and it forces congregations to rethink their values, and then they go through, and then there's already good solid research that has gone through that's looked at the nuance of all of those passages that you were referring to earlier, Jace. We have solid academics behind how that doesn't fit with our. None of that is a real condemnation of of a loving, committed same-sex couple in our current context. The condemnations are. It's not a direct fit. You can't lift an ancient concept and shove it into the modern era. So, and most of those things are in the Old Testament, by the way, and which we understand a lot of the laws that Christians are not required to follow that came through ancient Judaism or even pre-Judaism, Judean religion. Most of those prohibitions are understood to be extended by the grace that we have from Christ, that we don't have to follow the letter of the law from those places. I see the evangelicals nodding a little bit from memory of talk about grace. And so that gets us past a lot of the Old Testament, and there's some New Testament passages, some things that are just bad translation, and other things. I could go in, we call them the clobber passages in the progressive circles, and the texts of terror, yes. So we could,
terror.
I would guess both of us are well enough versed that we could go through those one by one, but we could also point to written materials out there that people could just sit and read on their own and not run through them one-on-one. But it's more about understanding context and nuance in the same ways that a lot of churches have moved past and understand women clergy, where it was thought to be that the Bible excluded that as well. We've moved past it on that, but the forefront of the debate is around sexual orientation, but really what it tends to come down to is there are large sections of the church that get focused on the Bible being the literal word of God and inerrant, and you can't change it in any way, and it's absolute. That's usually done in a not really not with integrity from my point of view, but that's the claim on the one side. And then there's large groups of Christianity that says that we really respect the Bible by giving it the attention and the study and understanding the nuance in it, by giving it that kind of respect, we're actually lifting it up in a way that doesn't just leave it as something that. Anyway, so it's a debate about how it's really more a debate about how we understand the nature of the Bible more than homosexuality. But this is the place where it's really coming to a fore in a lot of Christian circles these days.
So as far as applying like a similar way of looking at this to polyamory, the only thing that I've found about this at all are there's one sermon that someone sent me a recording of online, and like a couple writings that are part of the United Church of Christ that talk about polyamory. And one of them, one of the pastors comes out as being polyamorous, and that the other one, there's like two of them doing this particular sermon, and the other one talks about, maybe a few passages in the Bible talking about sort of making parallels to polyamory with the way that God loves us and, the way that God teaches us to love. I was just curious, like you said, that the debate isn't really on this, but it seemed like the research was being done about homosexuality before the debate even like really started being the thing that's happening. Is there a similar thing with polyamory or non-monogamy or other types of non-traditional relationships that people are starting to like critically analyze scripture with that in mind?
I would say totally. I mean, there's definitely, and I could point you to some academics that are writing about polyamory within Christian theology, at least, and using the Bible. And that's the big kind of claim that they're making, is that God's love is very polyamorous in nature, right? Christ the polyamorous Christ is kind of this new term that's gaining traction, which I'm all for. I mean, as an anecdote to like give that some like oomph to it. So like of communion, this is my body broken for you, blah blah blah. And so in Jewish tradition, so there's this idea of proposing when you propose to somebody, right? In this situation, it's man and woman, unfortunately. But man, the guy gives this cup of wine and he says, "This is my covenant for you." And if the girl drinks it, well, then she's accepting the proposal. And so some would say that the Last Supper is Jesus is proposing to 12 guys, right? And so it's very gay and very polyamorous, right?
Yeah.
So,
sorry, Em. I feel like your face was like so shocked when you realized how many drinks you've accepted from strange men.
I know. Yeah. I'm glad I'm not Jewish.
Oh my God. Just like anyone being like, well, I'm going to use that now.
Here's a drink. We're married now.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry, I feel like
yeah,
we cut
please
you
continue,
off.
JD.
No, you're fine. Wait. Now, obviously, I'm gonna say that there are a lot of symbols going on in the Last Supper, right? But that's just one of them. And there's this common symbol in the Bible and in a lot of New Testament theology that says that the church is the bride of Christ, right? And even so, it's very interesting to me. So in the evangelical world, there are a lot of the songs and prayers that are used talk about there's this very intimate, individualistic relationship that people have with God, and it's very erotic sometimes, right? I mean, my favorite example is this old song. It's not old, I guess, but it's like 90s or but there's In the Secret in the Quiet Place, I want to touch you. I want to.
I know that song.
Yeah.
I know that song.
So
Oh my God.
Yeah, right. And like you stop and think, well, that's kind of erotic, right? So, and yet it's evangelical. So it's that are doing that, which is funny. But there are queer theologians that are taking that and saying, well, maybe we have this erotic thing going on with Jesus, because I mean, also think about it. This is my body, right? You're taking somebody's body in your mouth, right? And so there's like phallic.
Pretty
references.
erotic.
I know,
Yeah.
right?
It's
Yes.
either erotic or cannibalism. So
Yeah,
I'll
I
go
know.
with-
Yeah,
Jeez.
you know, pick
And who's to say not both? But
exactly. Yeah. So, but either way, yeah, it's kind of crazy. But yeah, so there's this idea of the polyamorous Christ that's really that's gaining traction. But usually, the safe way to say it is that God loves everybody, and well, this isn't very safe to say, but God's a total slut, right? And so, in that sense, so.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I just have to say
Oh no,
that
that
like,
is funny. Yeah.
there's like the 12-year-old Christian girl in me is still alive apparently because there's
So
a part of me that's like I didn't think she was still in there, but she is. Sorry,
That's
please go
always
ahead.
Fun to find.
Yeah,
Comes out sometimes, Dedeker.
it does come out sometimes.
Yeah. Right. That actually brought to mind the part from the Bible where the Pharisees, I think, are quizzing Jesus, trying to catch him up on things. And they ask the question about, if a woman is married to a man and he dies, and then she marries his brother, and then he dies, and then she marries the next brother, and whatever. She ends up during her life being married to all the brothers because that's what you would do. And then when she died, who would be her husband in heaven?
Wow, you've read your Bible, my gosh.
He was almost going to go to seminary.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
Aw,
I
man.
came very close to
Like you basically sort of
Very different life you're leading now,
I know, and here
Jace.
you are running a polyamory
Oh.
podcast.
I actually think it's more similar than
Well, we could discuss that another time.
amen.
yeah, Mark 12 is what you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Whoa, that's impressive too.
It's great. It's cool. She does that too.
That's fine. I'm sure a lot of people know that. I'm just like, how? There's a
didn't
lot
know
of
that.
things, a lot of verses.
Well, hang on, you
And
were
I'm just-
leading up to something
I was just
referencing that verse.
I was just curious. Is that one of the ones that comes up? Are there others like that I've maybe missed out on? To kind of bring it back to polyamory, which is something I was curious to hear both of you talk about on this show, because like I said, it's something that I don't feel like is being talked about as much as the homosexuality thing.
I don't know if that passage is being done in academic circles around this. Looks
Not
like a no.
really. No.
But maybe fruitful for somebody's new paper if they're looking
Well,
for a
actually,
project.
no. Robert Goss, a queer theologian, he did
Okay.
do a paper on that. So I like.
And could you
Okay.
also, because I'm doubting my scripture quoting now, but so they ask him the question, like, who of these would be her
Yeah.
husband after, in heaven or in the kingdom of God or whatever. And
Who is it?
Jesus' answer was that it doesn't matter because you're kind of,
Oh,
I can. Yeah, want
Like-
to read it for you?
yeah, that'd
Okay.
be
This
great.
is the
wow.
answer, Jesus. I have my Bible out.
Oh, well. Jeez.
Perfect.
Someone's been doing their sword drills over here.
Right? Look up. So Mark
Sword
chapter
drills.
2. My God, that was good. But,
smart
verse
drills.
24 is where Jesus has this answer, right? Jesus said to them, "Is not this the reason you are wrong? That you oh shit. Oh no, this is it. For when they are raised from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses in the story about the bush? Oh God, I love when Jesus says bush.
The bush of God.
I know, right? I don't think of the burning bush. I think of something else. But
Yeah, I think
but
of
the point
the
is,
escutcheon.
yeah. The point is that there's no marriage in heaven, right?
Right.
And conservative circles like make marriage to be like this big thing. And
Yeah, there's no marriage in heaven?
no.
Yeah, it's just one big poly party.
It is.
Cool.
I think it's more just
At
like
least-
one big like solo poly party where it's like
Yeah,
you can be autonomous.
exactly.
You don't have to be with anybody, you know.
Yeah, I guess I always kind of thought of Jesus' answer being a little more Buddhist, of like,
Oh.
well, like you become one with all things, and there is no separation
mean-
between one thing and another. So
That makes sense.
That's
Yeah.
probably a little closer to it. It's like it's not about the body at that point.
Right.
I think more of what Jesus' answer is roughly around. But then it's about we are at the point where the human barriers that prevent us from loving each other, that are things that we should be trying to work to break down here, that's already broken down in the concept of heaven. And so so Jesus is kind of saying we're beyond that. It's like, and we would get a similar question now because we don't have that Levitical marriage concept where the widow has to be cared for by the siblings.
No.
But you hear people ask questions like, I was an amputee. Do I get my arm back when I'm in heaven? And like, I think Jesus' answer would be pretty similar. It's like you're thinking in the wrong areas. It's more about a much more broad love than about this level of human focused detail.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of like we're past the point of having this like individual identity that is separate from God to a certain regard, and like we kind of get closer to, I guess, that oneness or that something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I know you have some other questions.
Yeah.
I was just curious if there were any other sort of hit passages.
Some top 10 hits and verses.
Well, before we move away from this particular piece about, like I was talking about the more generalized love, the thing that we should be striving for as Christians. For me, it's like not even finding the Bible passages that might justify it. It's more about, I feel like there are enough barriers that keep people from finding a religious community that will help them have that kind of growth, that is something that so many people need. And to pick, and even if you did think it was sinful, to pick one thing and to focus on sexuality, and I would do that in broad strokes too, because there are a lot of folks that would condemn premarital sex, and we know how much that's happening out there. That there's just so much focus that if people are having loving consensual sexual practices and they're not doing it as a way of thinking they're rebelling against the church, that they're rebelling against God, like where's their heart while they're at it, that if they're really just focusing on caring for other people, like why should that be a barrier to somebody being able to get the things that we say that we value out of our faith and the way it's helped us in our own lives? I don't want to break that away for anybody, and I'm not going to focus on, and so I don't think that homosexuality or and not just homosexuality, I'm just caught in the language of the church again. But I don't think that sexual orientation is a barrier. I don't think that any sexual identity is in and of itself sinful, but how we engage in it. And so, but even if I did think it was a sin, I wouldn't focus on one sin and make that something that precludes somebody from being able to try to grow in all of these other areas. We're all on our own paths spiritually. And if somebody's at a different starting point than where you are, that to me is more about why we break away those barriers rather than find a scripture that says, oh, that makes it okay. It's how do we live into that loving example that Jesus set more than the letter of the law.
Yeah.
I would also say that, so you mentioned like sin, there's not specific passages that say it's sinful necessarily. And in our idea, like, so what Christians in the West think about sin is very unbiblical, at least in my opinion. The ideas of sin in the Bible are more about there's this other thing, right, going on. It's not like an action you do, it's something that's done to you, right? It's like in Leviticus again, there's this idea where they put all their sins onto this goat, and the goat just goes into the wilderness and dies. That it's like it's not like oh, you did this bad thing, so you sucked up, you fucked up, and so you're sinful. It's more nuanced than that, and it's a totally different way of it's not an ethics. That's one thing I would say. Sin does not equal ethics in the Bible. Sin is something else, and so it's hard to say, oh, is polyamory a sin in the Bible? Well, I don't know, who cares? But because sin is in the Bible is very different than in ethics. So,
gosh, I have like 5 billion things that I want to say in response to that. One of them being to build off what.
So that is literally where scapegoat comes from, by the way.
I just, a quick side note, I just love how that JD and Austin will be talking about things, and I'll see in the video here that Dedeker and I are like, right. And Emily's just like, what the fuck is happening? Like, her face is just like,
oh my God, yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
I didn't know about goats and stuff.
Yeah, you're gonna have to get used to the goat and the whole animal sacrifice thing, Emily. It happens a lot, and that's We're going to take a quick break to talk about some of the best ways that you can help to support our show. If you get value out of our show, if something that you've heard or some resources that we've recommended has been helpful to you in some way, we would really appreciate getting your support so that we can keep this show running and kind of keep getting this information, these resources out there. So the best way that you can support our show is to become one of our Patreon supporters. You can go to patreon.com/multiamory to sign up for that. We offer all kinds of different incentives for different Patreon tiers. At $5 a month, you get access to our private patron-only Facebook discussion group, which has so far turned into a really great community of people who've supported each other and listened to each other in difficult times. It's a great resource if something really difficult is happening in your life or your relationships and you just want a place to find advice or just support or encouragement or just someone to listen. It's been great for people for that. At our $7 a month level, you get access to that and ad-free episodes that come out a day early. At $9 a month, you get access to all of those things, plus our private video discussion group. So
right, which we just had last week.
Yeah, so a little bit more intimate, a little bit more focused, and a little bit more real-time processing with a bunch of different people from all over the place. It's really fun. And then at $15 a month, you get all that, and you're basically our best friend. So again, if you've gotten some kind of value out of this, and you can even pledge as low as $1. You can pledge as low as technically 25 cents per podcast if you feel like we're at least worth 25 cents. So again, you can go to patreon.com/multiamory.
Right. The next thing you can do that actually really helps us a lot more than I think most people realize is to take a moment and to write us a review on iTunes or on Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts that lets you write reviews. I guess you can't write reviews on all of the sites where you listen to podcasts, but specifically iTunes and Stitcher are the big ones as far as reviews go. And the reviews don't just, make us feel good and make us feel like what we're doing is worthwhile. They also help us to show up higher in search results, and they help other people to make the decision to give the show a listen. Right? There's a gazillion podcasts out there, and it's often hard to decide which ones you're actually going to take the time to listen to. And your reviews about our show, talking about what it is you get out of it, why you listen to the show, what sort of benefit you've gotten from it, will really help other people to make that decision and decide, oh, you know what? That applies to me too. I'll give this a listen. So that just takes a few minutes, and just do that at iTunes or Stitcher and write us a review.
And then our sponsor for this week is Quip, which is an amazing, amazing toothbrush company that the three of us have grown to love dearly. I love them because they are a portable, sleek, sexy toothbrush. It's like an electric toothbrush that's not super bulky and that you don't have to have like a separate charging station for. You just like pop in a AAA battery. It lasts for like 3 to 4 months and then you go. So the amazing thing is that they will send you a toothbrush head refill, which is just $10 every 3 months. The first one though is free with us, with your promo code tryquip.com/multiamory. Then you get the very first one free. And then from then on, every 3 months, you get toothpaste, a little travel toothpaste, a toothbrush head, and a little AAA battery to run your toothbrush for just $10. And it's super worth it because that's when you should be changing out your toothbrush anyways. And so, again, we love it. All three of us do. It's really hot. And go to, yes, Dedeker?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I finally got my replacement head along with the battery. And honestly, I have to be honest that at first I was skeptical. I was like, I don't need a replacement head that soon, like whatever. But then once I switched it on and once I switched out the battery, it was like, whoa, mama, like it is whoa, like mama. If you have a battery operated vibrator and you put new batteries in it, you're like, hoo, 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 hoo. It was just like that, but in my mouth.
What was I missing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So much. Yeah.
Yeah. I also
so definitely. Oh, yes.
I want to say about the subscription thing is that I also will, because I'm traveling a lot, like when I'm in the States, I'll reactivate my subscription so that I'm getting the new heads, and I also do the refill of the toothpaste as well because the prices are great. And I'll get those and then I'll kind of stockpile them. And then when I'm traveling, I won't do that. And maybe if I'm coming home for a little bit, I'll just order like one more replacement head or something like that. So it is also very like easy online to just activate it, reactivate it, turn it off for a while, or to order like a new cover for traveling or whatever. So it's
which I need to do.
Yeah, it's super convenient. So I've really liked it.
Yeah, so
Well-
they're amazing. And then they give a little kickback to us.
Yeah.
Again, if you go to tryquip.com/multiamory, order your quip through us, then we'll get a little kickback and you'll get your first head refill for free.
I want to start talking a little bit more about, I think, sex a little bit generally, outside of just the specifics of homosexuality or multi-partner relationships or things like that. Because obviously, the Christian church has not had a great track record with sexual moralism or sex positivity. And I was wondering, and especially, Austin, since it seems like you're really in the thick of this, are the both of you aware of if that's changing or if that's evolving, like the stance of the Christian church on the way that it handles just sex in general? Well, I don't know. I kind of lost the thread on what I'm trying to ask, but kind of like, what's the stance now on like what healthy sexuality is while still living a Christian lifestyle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm in the thick of it, I guess, and I'm actively working on trying to break that down. I think that mostly it's something that a lot of church folks have gotten really good at not talking about, partly because they know it's divisive, and so I think that's going to vary from context to context. And so by not talking about it in some contexts, it upholds the status quo, and in other ones it kind of holds to kind of more of a libertarian live and let live kind of mindset. But I would say it's actively part of the tension that it's around, but I don't know how, it would be hard to say how widely that is being shifted, but I'm part of trying to actively break down what I think is harmful sexual ethics, that particularly when all we tend to focus on saying in most churches is that it's okay after marriage, but bad before marriage, and that's really all we're going to talk about. And so for me, breaking it down, it's like, that leaves a whole lot of what people around us are actually engaging in the way that they live their lives, where we have ceded ground to have no moral authority whatsoever, when the church could also be focusing and saying rape is bad, sexual assault is wrong, and so trying to get and move it toward how do we be able to have a voice. And I think it's also a large part of what does keep people away from church is that they know that their lives, straight, queer, whatever, would not, they think would not be approved of in a church, and that alone means that the church is so hypocritical that they don't that they wouldn't be able to find a place there. So I'm trying to find ways of being able to say, without pulling the carpet out from under some folks, that really it doesn't matter who you're sleeping with, but how you take care of those people.
Mm-hmm. Preach it.
But I'm on the outside of that argument, but I'm trying to help make it more mainstream. And mostly, I think a lot of more progressive clergy are just afraid, have similar thoughts, but don't really have the courage to jump in and put themselves on the line for advocating something that's going to shake the boat. So it's which makes it really hard for folks to find a church where they might feel accepted, because it's something that is intentionally kept below the surface.
Right.
And so I would say I'm in grad school at a seminary, right? So the majority of people there are going to be a pastor someday, and a lot of my friends there are very progressive when it comes to sex. They're very against what at least scholars refer to as erotophobia, right? And so there's I think there, at least in this ELCA liberal Lutheran wing of the church, I can see, at least in the leadership, the shift moving from caring so much about where you put your genitals, a change from that to, I value consent, and I want to treat this person in front of me as a subject and not an object. And so I see that shift changing, but it's hard. So like in my denomination that I work in, the ELCA, the liberal Lutherans, there's this guideline for pastors, basically, that says you can't have sex outside of marriage, right? Seems kind of obvious to a lot of people that pastors shouldn't do that. But there's a groundswell of people saying that, well, the focus shouldn't be on sex before marriage. The focus should be on things like consent and everything after.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that would be a fantastic shift to see just in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But change is slow, and change in church is slower.
Oh God, yeah.
Of course.
Well, it's maybe you've heard something similar. I remember years ago, gosh, it was probably like 10 years ago or something, a friend of mine who did end up going into seminary after we went to college together, and he is a pastor now. He talked to me about some statistic, and I'm fudging these numbers, but it was something like 90% of pastors were raised in like a megachurch type setting. Like the majority of Christians are brought up in those because they're so big, but that 90% of pastors end up being pastors in much smaller churches. So there's this sort of interesting thing where like, well, obviously most of the pastor jobs are in all of these smaller churches, yet most of the Christians sort of being brought up are in these more mega churches. I wasn't sure if you'd heard anything like that, but I could see that being a way that kind of slows down that change in a way if the people still in those more mega churches aren't the ones changing, and it's just all the ones in these smaller churches that it would sort of slow down the evolution of who the new Christians are being brought up, at least statistically. But I don't know what exactly the statistics were. I just remember it being an overwhelming number is one, and then they end up in the other.
Interesting.
Anyway,
I don't know anything about that particular statistic. Do you, JD?
Cool. Well, maybe it's all crap. I don't know. Cool.
But
no worries.
But one of the other things that impedes progress in terms of what pastors talk about is also that a lot of pastors went to grad school a long time ago, and grad school, and so beyond sexuality, just in general, all of kind of the things that are better understandings of things that have come up. Pastors have been out of school for a long time, and they're not seeing what some of the newest academic work is putting out. And also they're still afraid to talk to their congregations about what was edgy even when they were in grad school. And there's clearly, listening to JD talk, there's a lot more edgy theology happening now than there was 50 years ago, but they're still scared of the theology they learned 50 years ago. And they're still kind of preaching what can I do without getting run out of my job? Like how far can I stretch people without alienating myself? And so that's a fear that a lot of pastors have. If you're in an environment where they're not looking to be more expansive. I'm fortunate enough to be in a space where people are hungry for new information and new ways of thinking about things. But that's not the norm in a lot of church settings.
Right.
Interesting.
And a lot of pastors are more concerned about job security than about bringing change.
Yeah, no, that's I would also say within like the Bible, for instance, as far as erotophobia or sex before marriage, all of these things go back to what we think of in our culture of as virginity. So in the Bible, virginity is only ever referred to women, right? And that's only because virginity is an economic thing in the ancient world. It's not a sexual thing. I mean, obviously, it refers to sex, but virginity was always put on women because men, in many senses, owned women, right? And so a virgin is much more economically valuable to a man than somebody who's not a virgin, because you want your offspring. You want to know that the babies that come out of this woman, you want to know that they're yours.
Right.
And there's economic implications of that. And so in the Bible, at least, in my opinion, there is not this overwhelming consensus that sex is bad or sex before marriage is bad. It's my opinion that in the Bible, sexuality is many times negatively tied to economics in some really harmful ways. And so it's hard to just put our ideas of what sexual ethics are onto the Bible or bring them onto the Bible because of how much economics was tied up in it all.
Well, I feel like that actually leads into my next question pretty well, which is that, as you know, we recently recorded a fun and pretty silly episode talking about instances of polyamory in the Bible, which, mostly turned out to be some maybe troublesome and maybe non-consensual polygamy, at least, mostly in the Old Testament. And it was so interesting that when I was researching this, that there's so many, there seemed to be kind of like three camps of interpretation that I saw. That either, I think more extreme camp, where either people interpret it as like, well, clearly this is what God established as like the ideal setup for a man to have multiple wives, and so that's what everyone should be aiming for. Or people interpret it as, well, everyone who is polygamous in the Bible, something bad happened to them. So God is clearly trying to send a message that
I did see that one too.
Yeah, that this is not the way that we should, that it should be just one man, one woman, or whatever. Or people kind of take the route of like, it was, that's what people did at the time, and we don't need to worry about it. Is there any other kind of interpretation that people are throwing up there in talking about these instances of polygamy in the Bible, or is there any other conversation around that right now?
JD?
I would say that, so a simple way to think about it, when you read the Bible isn't always saying this is the way things should be, right? So you have to ask the question, is the story you're reading, is the parable or teaching you're reading talking about the way things are, or is it talking about the way things should be? And so I think there's this story in Genesis 34 where this woman named Dinah, who this not have any voice at all in the narrative, she's raped by this man, and in the Hebrew, there's this word defiled. I forget the actual Hebrew word, but this word defiled is not put on her rapist, right? It's put on her. And so, and there's a lot of other horrible things about that story that I'm not even going to go into. But so I would say that is a depiction of the way things are and not the way things should be, right? And so when we read the Bible, we have to ask that question, I think. We get those screwed up. And so that probably doesn't answer your question at all. But,
no, it makes sense to me.
It's actually very related to a conversation that three of us were just having the other day, because we've been recording some episodes for a new podcast that we're putting together where we're reading through the whole Bible. And
wow.
Yeah, it's gonna take a number of years.
It's ambitious.
But reading through it, so Emily will finally know what the heck it's all about.
So we'll finally know what the heck it's all about.
I haven't read the whole thing. It's a fun project. I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
Be careful how.
Oh, it's the most dangerous book ever written. I mean, come on.
I thought it was the greatest story ever told.
Oh, Emily. So my partner is an atheist, and so he says the same kind of shit.
That's great.
I absolutely love it. So
I mean, I'm just saying what people say.
Oh no, I love it. Oh, totally.
Now we've been training her. Anyway, in that conversation, though, I think Dedeker was the one who made the point that she said, the interesting thing about the Bible is that it's both a cultural piece, it's a historical piece, as well as a theological and belief-related one. That it is kind of each of those. And I think kind of what you're getting at, JD, is if we think that this whole document is just this is how you should live your life, then we're going to get into some confusing territory and maybe make some, we could read that and go, oh, I guess that means it's okay for this guy to do that and that women are defiled, rather than realizing, oh, this is also a history and that this is also showing us what was happening in this culture at these various times throughout, when it was written. So I think that's interesting. But I've been thinking about that a lot, of thinking of the Bible and putting it in place historically, versus the way that at least I think the Bible is presented to a lot of us, especially when we're children growing up Christian, or at least it was for me, or to, outsiders like Emily, where it's sort of this is the book that has all the answers, right? That this shows you how to live your life. I think
this is the instruction manual.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's funny because there are other religious teachings like writings by Siddhartha and stuff that are more of an instruction manual. So I think it can be really misleading because we think the Bible must be that same sort of guidebook of
I saw both of you shaking your head at that. So what was that about?
All of it. It's It's incredibly complicated. I mean, and I shook my head no a little bit at one point, but mostly yes. But the no to it being a complicated document. It is not one document. It is a library of things that were, well, stories that were told without being written down for a long period of time, but told and written down by multiple authors over a period of centuries. So it's not a cohesive document, and in fact, it's often in dialogue with itself. Or if you talk about it as a whole, because an individual author is referring to something that a previous author said, but that they might have some disagreement with, and they get into other details. So it's very complex, and each of the different pieces has its own context and background that have from periods that we don't have a whole lot of sociological and anthropological information, but what we do have is helpful in getting at what more is going on. But if you look at it as a guidebook and like this is an instruction manual, that's scary because I mean, just to use the story of Dina that JD was bringing up, her brothers get revenge by forcing all of the whole city that the rapist came from and all of his servants to like basically come into their family, and which means they need to become Jewish. So they insist that they all have circumcisions as adults. And so I'm waiting for Emily's face on this. And
Emily, I told you there are many instances of mass circumcision in the Bible. I told you about that.
And so then they force the mass circumcision on them. And then while they're recovering from the surgery, they come in and kill all of them. But while they're all
wedding part 2, or I guess part 1.
So if you read the Bible as an instruction manual, that would say, well, your sister gets raped, so you go and kill the rapist and everybody else that's in close proximity to that person.
But like, first circumcise them.
Like it's like we're looking at broad strokes rather than fine points, and it does help us. It is a very useful guide, but it is not an instruction manual.
Right.
It helps us think about the complexities of how humans have been fucked up for centuries and the damages and people navigating, people around them being awful to them and trying to figure out how to scrap and survive. It's a story of people who were colonized, or it's multiple stories of people who were colonized grappling with what it means to relate to their colonizers. So many things that are rich, but like not like universally applicable. And that's what most of our lives are like. And so if we look at the Bible as people who are struggling with their faith as we do in ways that have some universal human elements to them, that we aren't just going through everything new ourselves, but we see their context and we see our own, and we have to figure out how do we live in love based on where we are and based on the examples. Can we learn from other people's lessons is actually a lot of what the Bible is about. And that's how I prefer to live my life, is like I'd rather see somebody else make a mistake and not have to make it myself. But human nature usually means we do need to fuck up in our own ways as well. So it just and so it's a constant work of recovery, and and that's where the apologies and atonement and grace come in. It's where confession and Christian worship, for some people it feels like, it means that we're being forced to talk about how bad we are. It's like, we know we've got our problems. I see it as a ritual that enables us to recognize that we can be forgiven, not that we have to find ways to feel bad about ourselves, but to let go of the things that we already feel bad about. And I'm riffing on multiple tangents here, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm seeing some nodding, and I hope that that's useful.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate both of you saying all of this, because again, from an outsider's perspective, what I know about Christianity is just that, like, it's evangelical, and that you're supposed to abide by what this book says. And, in just the very little that I've read of it, which now has been more than I ever have before because of Jason Deneker, but it just seems like a lot of stories, and some of them not very well written. And so I'm just like, what, obvious, some of them.
Hey, most people start out reading the Bible trying to get through Genesis, and then you can't get past the begat after so-and-so begat.
Oh,
and it's just like,
we're getting through. That's why I say that.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Not great prose.
Yeah. No, but I so appreciate that there can be all these different viewpoints and still within like the context of faith and the context of God and this being an important thing, but still that like there's a lot of leeway, I guess, like more so than I previously thought. And that something that Jason Dedeker have both said to me is that there's like a need for community and for even if you're not like practicing religion, it seems like there is like a need for community and that space still. And obviously, like we still know people who are polyamorous who also are religious. And so from that, like I was just wondering, like, do you have any advice that you can give someone who considers themselves still Christian and they might still go to church, but they are also polyamorous and like, you know, there's all these things out there like stigma and misunderstanding and backlash, and that may potentially come from their community. But is it still possible for someone who's religious to come out as polyamorous, or do you think that they're just going to have a really difficult time doing that? Do you have any like good advice for them?
Yeah, it's really hard. At least so my experience. So when I came out as polyamorous to like the church leaders, like people that made sense to talk to them about. I think some of my youth know that I'm polyamorous because they ask questions, and that's fine. And I would say a lot of people are totally okay, but it's the church, like at least the pastors sometimes, I think they are open. I think they're worried about the repercussions it'll have on the church, the ministry, etc. You know, the reputation, specifically if you're leadership in the church. So I would say it hasn't, at least for me, it hasn't been that positive. But I mean, I still have a job, so I think that's a good sign. You know what I mean? There is, if I was trying to be a pastor, right, at this seminary I'm at, and I was openly polyamorous, there would be a good chance. So there's this thing called a candidacy committee in the Lutheran Church. There's a good chance that somebody would tell the candidacy committee, and they'd grill me about it, and they'd be like, "Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't meet up to this document called Guidelines and Expectations." It's kind of the rules for pastors and quote unquote roster leaders, they call it. And so if you're leadership in the church, I think it's really hard, but especially if you're a pastor. Good luck, I guess, is honestly what I would say. But if you are just trying to practice your religion, I think there are some churches that are totally fine with lay people, with just regular old church folk being polyamorous. I mean, obviously, it'd have to be a liberal church. If a church is like openly for gay and queer folk, my guess is that you probably won't have that much pushback on polyamory. But if you start trying to become a leader, XYZ, you might still have problems. But that's at least my experience.
Yeah. And I would say it's really going to vary very much by congregation. And what the situation and what the local situation is, and people will have to figure out their own setting for themselves about whether a space is safe or not. There's not a clear prescription that we can give, but I wouldn't try to come out as polyam. If I was a person looking for a church who was polyamorous, I wouldn't come out as polyam as at a church that wasn't already explicitly welcoming of LGBTQIA folks. And especially if they don't ordain women ministers. And there are clues that you can look at as to how open a congregation might be. If you're looking for a new congregation, then you can start to look for those things and have a side conversation with the pastor to see whether this is a safe place for you to come in. But if you're already locked in a congregation and you feel like that is your home community and you don't know whether you want to or not, I would probably recommend trying to find a small group of allies, maybe even have a study group together where you can create a little subsection of the church that is open, more so than just kind of jumping out and scaring everybody's grandma, for example. Like it's like people or you figure out how much you can shift the system from within, and whether you're just going to be beating your head against the wall. And in some cases, it might just mean you do have to find another church, and that's unfortunate. But there are people who had to leave churches for worse reasons than this.
Yeah. I know there's a specific site, and I'm not finding it specifically in my Google searches now, but it seems like there's a lot of similar sites. There are databases where you can search for churches kind of based on how LGBTQI friendly they are. And I know that the particular database I'm thinking of, it will even like kind of, it'll reference like, this is kind of the language used on the church website, and that's why we think that they're very pro-LGBT, or they specifically, say something about ordaining women ministers or whatever. So there are a number of search engines out there to find this kind of thing if you're specifically trying to find a church.
Yeah, I imagine with Google these days, you could probably find find some resources around you.
Right.
Maybe you'd have to drive a little further to go to church now than you used to, but hopefully that would be worth it. And we've actually said similar things. If you're in parts of the country where it's hard to find like a polyamory meetup or something like that, that it's worth it if you have to drive a few hours even to have some kind of community, maybe once a month or every couple months, or just something to actually have a little bit of time where you can talk without constantly having to monitor, what am I saying? Am I giving myself away? Am I going to say something that I'm going to regret? To like have that opportunity to do that, even just for a little while, is so important. And so I could see with a church that being very similar, where it's like, it's worth it to drive a little further, even if it means you don't go quite as often. I could see that really being worth it, to be in a space where you can really get the support, that you need for your own growth.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. I feel like we could do a whole new podcast where we just talk about this stuff for every week for an hour. But thank you so much for coming and talking to us about all of this. It's been awesome. I've been looking forward to this episode for quite a while now.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was great to talk with you guys.
Gosh, that was amazing. My mind is blown. There was so much to learn there. For those of you out there who really, this isn't like second nature because you haven't been indoctrinated with the Bible like for years and years and years. It's lovely to just get some amazing perspectives from these two lovely people that we just talked to. So we really appreciate you being on the show. And if you would like to get in touch with us, send an email to info@multiamory.com or send us a message on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. You can also leave us a voicemail at 678-MULTI-05. Or you can leave us a voice message on Facebook. To support our show and join our private Facebook community, go to patreon.com/multiamory. Multiamory is created and produced by Jace Lindgren, Dedeker Winston, and me, Emily Matlack. Our episodes are edited by Mauricio. Our social media wizard is Will McMillan. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.
Life on the Swing Set is heading to paradise for the 7th time, and once again, we're taking over Desire Resort Riviera Maya in Cancun, Mexico.
With this year's hosts, me, Cooper, Ginger, Dylan, JV and Char from Ending the Sexual Dark Age, and author, podcaster, and feminist porn filmmaker Tristan Taramino, our takeover allows us to mold the resort in our geeky, sexy, and inclusive image with orgies, classes about pegging, flogging and fisting, theme nights, a full dungeon night, naked karaoke, mutual masturbation, and massages.
From November 3rd through the 10th, 2018, this beautiful, all-inclusive resort will be full of sexy swing setters from every letter in the LGBTQA spectrum. Poly, swingers, nudists, kinksters, doms, subs, and those who are just curious about what a week at a sexy resort offers.
We take all the best of the swing set, our values, our experience, our co-hosts, our community, and we bring it all together with the best resort staff on earth to create a queer, kink, and poly-friendly, consent-aware, and sexy as hell experience for everyone who joins us.
To come with us on our Swing Set Takes Desire 2018 trip and hear us podcast about our previous trips, head over to ssdesire.com. We'll be there to welcome you home.